Hey there. Welcome to the Freelance Road Trip Podcast. I'm Alvalin Lundgren. We're talking about negotiating. Tips for negotiating, the purpose of negotiating, and the hoped-for outcome of negotiating a project with a client. And why are we talking about negotiating? Because you want a good outcome. You want a good relationship with your clients, and it's better to come to terms before you begin a project than trying to rethink things and change the, shall we say, rules of the road when you're in the middle of the project. And negotiating skills are not taught to designers and other creatives in design school, but they are part of business, and therefore they're necessary for any creative who is doing business with clients. So I want to offer some tips and hopefully wise counsel that I have gleaned over the years, sharing it with you so that you can increase your effectiveness working with clients and have better outcomes. So negotiating, by definition, out of the dictionary, is the process of obtaining something or bringing something about via conversation, via discussion. Any agreement that you come to with a client has to be first discussed, and that discussion process is a negotiation. The word negotiate originates from the Latin negotiat, which means to be done in the course of business. So there is a strong business understanding that this is about enterprise, that this is about profitability, that this is about making a living. And it's not something you do in leisure or in personal relationships necessarily. The point is to reach an outcome, to bring something about via conversation or discussion. And it's definitely business related. So therefore, it's a business skill, and if it's a skill, it can be learned. It's not a skill that they teach you in design school. When you go to design school, and if there are business classes, negotiation techniques are not addressed. But yet, they are the means by which we create proposals and contracts and send out invoices. And negotiating brings the client and the creative together in alignment because they've talked it through and they've come to an agreement. So in negotiations, both parties, you as the freelancer and your client, want to believe that you have a fair outcome. When you work with a client who believes they've received the short end of the stick, does not make for a good working relationship. And if you have the sense that you are not being valued or you are receiving the short end, and it's not a value for value exchange because the client's getting more and you're getting less, that doesn't make for a good relationship. When there's not an equality between a freelance creative and their client, that creates resentment on the part of one party or the other. Resentment will affect the working relationship. It'll affect the creative process. It'll affect the outcome of the work and the quality of the work and the effectiveness of the work. So negotiating is an important thing to do before you embark on a creative process with a client. So why do we negotiate? So as soon as you begin discussing a project, you are in the negotiation process. Both you and your client have goals for the project, and negotiation is how you bring your goals into alignment. So in a successful negotiation, both your client and you have respect for each other. You treat each other the way you want to be treated. You give each other what you each need. It's a transactional relationship. It is an exchange that goes on. So negotiation is a discussion that leads to an agreement. And again, it relates to business transactions. So looking at the process of negotiation, there are 6 aspects that are involved. There's the rate. What will you charge the client for your creative services? There's the scope of work or the amount of work. What exactly are you creating for the client? There's the schedule and deadline. When is the work needed? There are payment terms. How will you be paid? There are the transfer of rights. So what rights are going to be transferred to the client and for how long? What rights are retained by the creative? And then there's also degree of difficulty, which is how difficult will the client be to work with, or how complex and complicated is the project itself. So if you have a pricing structure that is set amounts for certain things, or it's an hourly structure, it's your choice if your creative rates are negotiable or not. If you're a copywriter, for example, it's this many words and it costs this much. Now, if you have established fees, before you can offer a price for the work, you have to know the full scope of the work, because there will usually be scope creep, which means that the client will expand on the amount of work by throwing in other things or shifting things around. You should expect that type of thing to happen. And then you have to stop in the middle of the project and renegotiate. If you have a client who is asking for a reduction in your fees, you have to negotiate that. And these are things that you should do prior to even starting any creative work, even starting any preliminary research or throwing out ideas or anything like that. Get everything set up and in writing and agreed to up front so that you and your client are in alignment before you proceed. It's kind of like using freelance road trip terms. When you are going on a road trip and you have people going with you, they have to be going in the same direction. So everybody gets in the car, there's the driver, that'll be you. Client gets in, and you have to agree to go in the same direction to get to the destination. So you have to be in agreement, you have to be in alignment. If you decide to negotiate with a client for a lower fee instead of modifying the scope of work to lower the fee, decide on a minimum acceptable rate, or an MAR. So it is the minimum engagement idea. What is the least amount you will accept for doing the work? And remember that as a freelancer, it's not just the hourly, it's the overhead. So you have to consider all of the kind of hidden expenses involved in creating work. If you're working digitally, you have the cost of electricity. You have the cost of software subscriptions. So it's not just your time, it's the overhead of your freelance business that also has to be considered when you set your rates. Also taxes and insurance, marketing expenses. So you have your business overhead plus the project rate or the number of hours on the project. That's your minimum acceptable rate. So the downside of this is that you cannot accurately project the number of hours you will invest in a project. When you're negotiating, you don't want to compete on price point. A client will always be able to find somebody to do it cheaper. So price should not be the value that you bring to the table. So be aware of what your competition charges. Be aware of your competitive advantage, your secret sauce, your uniqueness, your differentiation in your market. Be aware of what your competition does, the quality of their work, and compete on expertise and experience. Even if you're starting out, and I've talked about this in a previous podcast, compete on what you know, compete on your uniqueness as a creative, compete on your experience. So this also means that you need to establish your reputation beyond the range of the negotiations. You have to grow your skill, you have to gain experience, and you have to brand your business so you're targeting the right kind of clients. The lower the quality of work, the more competition you will have. And the more competition, the more likely you will have to compete on the basis of being the cheapest. And I've often said, winning the project because you are the cheapest option, it's not good positioning for your brand. It's not going to serve you well. You might want to look at the going rate for similar work done by similar freelancers and small firms in your area, and also in the client's area. Since we do a lot of business online, your clients may not be in your community. They may not be in your city. So you have to consider what the client can afford and what they're used to, but also what you need. And another thing to consider are the non-financial benefits. Will taking up this project lead to more and better projects? Will it help you attract the kinds of clients you want to work with? Will it give you more exposure in your target market? Will the client refer you and recommend you to their colleagues? So there are non-monetary benefits of taking on any project. And quite often I've talked about taking on projects that will propel you forward, increase your skill, and increase your influence in the marketplace. Another thing to consider is what is the potential for future work with the client. And this is a choice because there's no guarantee of future work with any client. Once a project is concluded and the deliverables have been delivered and you've been paid, there's no guarantee that any client is going to return and work with you on another project. So this is kind of iffy. There are times where clients will be looking to reduce the fee for a larger scope of work by making a promise of future work. If you do this for this much, I will be able to bring you more work. So you can negotiate on this basis if you are assured that there will be more work from the client in the near future. But then you have to consider how likely, how probable is that? Because again, you don't want to shortchange yourself. You don't want to feel like you have the short end of the stick. And there's also, is this a client that you will want to work with again? You might get into the middle of the project with the client and they're all of a sudden showing their true colors. They're difficult to work with. They're causing frustration and you don't want to work with them again. But if you have lowballed your fees, you've negotiated a lower fee, you're going to not feel really good about the relationship and you're not going to want to work with the client again. So there's a lot of factors that you have to consider when you have a set fee structure, whether it is a per item or you charge hourly. I talk about pricing quite a bit in the Freelance Road Trip Business School program and why value pricing, which always requires negotiation with the client up front, is the better way to go because it's just a more effective outcome. If you don't have set fees, as I said, you're always having to negotiate. Every new project is a negotiation. Every project is unique. Every client is unique. Clients come with different budgets, different degrees of difficulty, different scopes of work. So having set fees or flat fees can be difficult. When you are looking at value-based pricing, you are far more flexible to work with a variety of clients, and your pricing is always your choice. The fees you set for one project with a client over here will be different than the fees you set for another client on their project over there. For better outcomes from the negotiations and a better negotiating process in the first place, you need to interview the client. You need to know what the client wants. You need to know if you want to work with them. You need background information, so you need to do some research before you start negotiating. Negotiating is not always done, and it depends upon the level of work and the level of client, but generally speaking, you don't negotiate immediately once you hear from a client that they've got this project. In terms of you don't let them know what your price is. You find out what they need. You find out some history from them in that inquiry call or that first meeting. So just as the client would be interviewing you to see if you're the right one to run with, you also need to interview the client. It cuts both ways. So you need to do some research on the client. You can do that either by asking them questions and discerning from their responses to those questions whether or not you want to proceed. Or you can end the inquiry call and say, I'll get back to you, and go do some research on the client. The client, if they are a legit business, should have information online, whether it's on LinkedIn, they have a website, they should have a website if they have a business. They should have social media. And so you need to find out what they're doing currently and what problems you observe with their visual and or verbal messaging. And think about ways you can solve the problems, but don't share those ideas with the client until you're actually in a contracted relationship. But bring your conclusions, the results of your research, not fixes, but results of your research to the negotiating table. You'll also want to ask the right questions. When you're talking with a client about their project, you will have already done some basic discovery on them. And then the information that you learn in your research is the basis for additional investigation. Doing your homework, doing some research on the client lets the client know that you're aware of their enterprise, and you can also ask intelligent questions. And this puts you in a strong position to negotiate. For example, if you've done your research and noticed there's some problems with the website, you can point those out. You might say something like, in doing a graphic audit of your current website, I noticed that it's not responsive. It's not mobile friendly. You're probably losing visitors, which means you're losing customers. What do you think about that? So you want to find out the client's needs. You want to know their ideal customer profile, their geographic reach, how they will use the work you create, how soon they need it. You want to look for opportunities to upsell or cross-sell. For example, say your client is a publication. Maybe the client is going to be a trade association, and they have a newsletter publication that they send out to their members. And maybe it's only in print, or maybe it's only online. You can cross-sell or upsell by saying, how about putting it in an app format so that people can easily access it through the app? How about using email to send articles directly to people on the email list? If you can upsell or cross-sell, especially if you have a menu-based pricing structure or an hourly-based pricing structure, you can glean more revenue from the project. So look for those opportunities. Many times the client will come saying, well, I need this or I need that. But what they really need to accomplish their goals, their business objectives, is not just this and that, but the other. They might be inquiring about the initial thing, but then you have the opportunity in inquiring about their business objectives to then ask about other possibilities. If the client is budget-minded, if they have a very limited budget, or they're looking for the cheapest option, and you decide you do want to take on the job, no matter what your pricing structure is, the key idea is not to reduce your fees. Instead, reduce the scope of the work to accommodate your fees. You can reduce the number of concepts you develop. Maybe you only show them one concept. Reduce the number of reviews and revisions. In your contracts, you should always have a limit on number of revisions and number of creative reviews. You can reduce the number of deliverables. You can limit the geographic distribution of the work. In other words, it's local or regional, it's not national. You can limit the rights being transferred, including the duration and the specific rights. Another key tip in any negotiation is be willing to decline the project and walk away. The client may come back and agree to your full rate, but if not, you've not lost anything except some negotiating time and research time. There are certain things you don't want to do when you're negotiating with a client. One is to offer a discount or reduce your fees. Don't devalue your work in that manner. If you devalue your work by reducing your fees, you're also affecting the industry at large. You're affecting other creatives who do what you do, because there is a ripple effect. Always modify the scope of work to fit the client's budget. Don't modify your fees to fit the client's budget. And stand your ground. Don't agree to throw in things. Don't agree to any sort of scope creep or add-ons. So, for example, the client will ask you, so while you're doing the website, can you add a logo? I don't have a logo. You'll have to create it and then just add it to the top so people will know it's me. So the logo is a separate creative project, and the logo actually should come first prior to the website, and the logo should be the result of a branding process. Even if it's a small client, there should be, you don't just pull a logo out of thin air if you're going to do a logo correctly. So your response can be something like, yeah, I can create a logo for you, and that'll I've done logos for between this amount and that amount, and that's going to be a separate project and one that should be done first before I develop your website. because the logo is the basis for all your branding. And if the client says, well, wait a minute, can't you just do it as part of the website? Then your response is, well, it's a separate visual asset. You're going to be using it on more than just your website, are you not? A logo represents a company. It's a trademark. It is a visual representation of a company or business. Developing an effective logo requires some thoughtful strategy, and it's foundational to your branding program. It's therefore a separate project, and it has to come before the website. So I'll submit a proposal for the logo project, and let's talk about what you want your logo to do. Project additions, also known as scope creep, use change orders. I talk about change orders. They are types of contracts. I talk about them in the Freelance Road Trip Business School program, and how to use them, when to use them, how to ensure that you'll get paid for the extra work. If you use change orders, you don't have to stop the project and renegotiate an entire contract. Another thing you want to avoid is actually agreeing to an exact amount verbally. This is especially if you're doing project pricing or hourly pricing. You always want to communicate a range or a ballpark amount. For example, in the past, I've designed websites ranging from $10,000 to $6,000, and then depending upon the features and functionality. So what you do is you put an exact amount in writing only when you have all the information about a project. And when you state a range, my fees are generally between this and that, you want to ask the client, does that fit your budget? Or is that what you were expecting? And then at that point, if the client says no, you can ask what they were expecting or what they did have allotted. And if they say, well, there is no budget, then you can say, well, there's always a budget. Because if I come back and say this is going to be $25,000, and you say, well, that's too much, that's a budget. You have a figure in mind that you want to pay for this. So there's always a budget. Another thing not to do is agree to do something for less if the client gives you a credit line or promises exposure. Never work for exposure. Never work for a credit line. Credit lines and exposure are meaningless. Do you do your creative work as a designer, illustrator, photographer, copywriter just to say it was you who did the work, or are you working for a living? What is the best business decision for you? How will credit lines and exposure help pay your rent? How will they help pay your mortgage and buy your kids' school supplies? The only exception you might make to this is an in-kind sponsorship when you're working with a nonprofit, and that again is your choice. Be sure the organization understands the full value of your services and that you have a written agreement for the sponsorship, including their 501c3 number, and that you follow up to enforce the terms of the sponsorship. An in-kind sponsorship should be the only time you do something for cost or for less than your regular minimum rate for a credit line, because even sponsoring something is no guarantee that you're going to get more work. It does help with reputation and influence and building awareness in your marketplace, but it does not guarantee you revenue. Understand that and make your decisions accordingly. So let's talk about rush work or immediacy fees. Rush work is usually asked for by the client. Basically, it's a shorter turnaround than is normally appropriate. Rush work means that you put other things aside to get this done on time for the client. It might mean you're working weekends or evenings or pulling all-nighters just to get the work done. With rush work, you should know what rush means to you because you have a process, you have a creative development process, and you should know in general how long something is going to take you in terms of the time, how many hours you actually work in a day versus personal and family time and sleep time and things like that. So you should know that designing a logo will take you 2 or 3 weeks all in, or 2 or 3 months all in, depending upon how you work and the total scope of everything you do within that project. You should have an idea. And then you will know what rush means. Rush means you need to get it done faster or sooner than you normally would. So even when you come to an agreement, take a day or two to consider the entire agreement before you submit your contract or your proposal. Remember, you're talking about all of this up front. So the negotiating conversation takes place before you submit a proposal or a contract. You don't submit a contract and then negotiate it. You don't submit a proposal and then negotiate it. You negotiate it, submit the proposal. Now with a proposal, after the client reads it and makes decisions about it, then you can still negotiate on it because it's not necessarily a contract. But once you submit a contract, the contract should address everything you've talked about. So there are no questions. There's nothing dropping through the cracks. There are no, oh, by the ways, as you move into the creative process with the client. So after you've had your discussion and you've made notes and you're coming to terms and you've summarized everything, then you put it into a proposal. Take a few days to consider everything before you submit the proposal or the contract. Now, if the client is submitting the contract to you, as sometimes happens with certain, especially government agencies or institutions that have a purchase order process, some things will not be negotiable in that. In all other cases, you want to supply the contract to the client because the client will not be dealing with rights transferred and creative reviews and things like that in their contracts because they're using boilerplate contracts or they're using a different type of contract that doesn't accommodate creative work and intellectual property and transfer of rights. So you should always be supplying the contract to the client. You should always be supplying the proposal to the client. In any case, read things over, whether you've written them or the client has written them. Read everything over, chew on it, ruminate on it, make decisions, and wait a few days before signing. You'll get a more objective perspective by taking time, and you'll miss fewer problems, fewer concerns, fewer red flags if you take time. A couple other things I want to caution you against. Do not ignore red flags. If there's something about the client that makes you uncomfortable in any way, stop the negotiations and decline the project. You do not have to go through with anything. If you are not comfortable, don't agree to anything. Do not chase a client. Sometimes a prospective client becomes uncomfortable during negotiations. This can be due to any number of factors, including they really don't have the budget. They're not able to control the process. They're not serious about the project in the first place. So they may go silent and unresponsive, which may mean they've changed their mind, they've found somebody else, or they can't proceed with the project. You don't know. So if a client doesn't respond to your first follow-up query, don't pursue them. Don't call them and offer to work for less and throw in your firstborn if they give you the project. Just let them go. Turn your attention to attracting better clients or attracting your best clients. And clients who don't communicate are not your best clients. You don't want to go less than. You want to be on equal footing. You want to position yourself as a fellow business owner who's concerned about the same things for your own business that your client is concerned about for their business. You do want to be professional in all cases, and that basically means treating prospective clients and clients with respect throughout the negotiating and working process. You want the client to see you as trustworthy, professional, a person with integrity, a person who has expertise and skill, who is confident and knows what they're doing. So you want to be specific, you want to exude confidence, and you want to position as a problem solver for the client. They have a problem, they have a need, you have the means of solving the problem and filling the need. Clients will always naturally look out for their own interests and will often come up with a larger budget if they understand the quality and value of the work you're creating for them and the ease of working with you. In all cases, be aware of how you come across, know your value, know your own non-negotiables. Another thing to understand, and this is the last point I'll make, is that negotiations are not arguments where one person has to win and the other crawls out the door all scathed and wounded and injured. Although you and the client may differ on many points, the negotiation process is not a debate. One party should not be out to prevail over the other, but there's a mutuality in the agreement. It's a peer-to-peer, not a one-up, one-down idea. You don't want to be above your client, and you don't want to be the one on the bottom. You don't want to be below your client. Always work for peer-to-peer. Treat others the way you want to be treated, like Jesus teaches. Out of my own personal experience, I have found that although I might have disagreements with certain clients, the points on which we disagree are mitigated, or they become secondary to the value of respecting the client as a fellow human being, respecting that they have business goals and objectives and budgets that they need to adhere to. But you want your prospective clients to also respect you and your business requirements and objectives. So it has to be for mutual benefit. Negotiating should not be a contest. It's a conversation you have to reach an agreement. Well, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. I'm Alvalyn Lundgren, and this is the Freelance Road Trip Podcast. We're located at the intersection of inspired creativity and common business sense to help you accelerate your freelance business. It's where you get the street smarts they don't teach in design school. The show notes for this episode are at freelanceroadtrip.com/show 123. That's show 123. You can connect with me on Twitter at freelancetrip, on Instagram at freelanceroadtrip, and check out Freelance Road Trip on YouTube. May you prosper in all things and be in health as your soul prospers, and I'll see you on the road.